So this is the propane heater that we mentioned that we can turn on periodically as needed.
Lord, I'm doing one.
April, isn't your water bottle?
Okay. I don't know. Yeah, he's just familiar to me. I mean, have you spent time with him? Okay. I don't know. We'll see if it's been bugging me. I'm like, I know that girl.
Feel free to come up closer. It might be easier to see.
Yeah.
You can also kind of, if you want to, sit on the ground. And you just have a backrest.
So we are going to be filming this, so the camera's right there. So just be aware that as you move around, and request that nobody sits in that.
That bail right
That
there.
bail is right in the front there. So as I said, people are getting some more hot water. This here is sort of the schedule for today. We'll start with an hour and a half chunk, going over sort of the first part of permaculture theory and design. And we're going to be focusing on ecology, which is sort of the foundation for permaculture, and then going into some of the basics of permaculture. And then we'll take a break, come back, and then go through some more strategies and frameworks for thinking about designing with your property or with your land. And then breaking for lunch. And there's plenty of leftovers, and people are welcome to help themselves to the leftovers from last night. Then we'll be regrouping back here for going over some basics of forest ecology and also going over some observation techniques that will help you think about how to orient your land and how to sort of really listen to the landscape, because that's so much of what permaculture is about learning from the natural world and then incorporating that into your techniques for growing food or other materials.
Yeah, and while general principles of ecology are good to understand, you really have to look at like the specific site and the specific conditions that you're wanting to plant in, both like the whole climate of the area, as well as like the specific little microclimate of the place that you're going to be planting it.
And then we'll, like we said yesterday, we'll do a walkabout on part of the property, pointing out certain structures in the forest that sort of seeing in real life, in living form, some of the theoretical concepts that we've been talking about. And then sort of let you guys spend some time with the forest on your own, practicing these observation techniques, and then regrouping and sharing about what people see, what things were difficult, and sort of talking about relevancy for permaculture and design. And so and then we'll break and then have dinner and then regroup again for the social component. Yeah.
Does your talk, is it reproduced on the handout? Or is yours
So the handout is more supplemental material.
Okay.
We're creating more or less complementary content. Content. So that the handout goes into more depth about some of the things that we don't have time to go into depth here, but are resources that we want to make available to you all as you can take this material and begin to incorporate it and integrate it into your understanding and so on. So generally we're going to be moving from the more theoretical, the more abstract, into the more practical, more hands-on. And then of course that will be very hands-on tomorrow when we work on the humiculture bed, and you'll want work gloves and things along those lines. So I guess if there's any questions about format or anything like that, you guys are welcome to ask questions as we go along.
We'll kind of have breaks in between each little subsection that we're talking about for people to ask questions, so you don't have to hold them all to the end. But it's sort of be more, the information will be a bit more compartmentalized for people to ask questions about.
And it does seem as though people here have varied experience, and this is more of like an introduction to permaculture, and so it might be review for some of you, and maybe new information for others. Hopefully, we hope that everybody will get something out of it.
Hopefully we can share like anecdotal stuff about our experience with all of these basic concepts and a little bit of how like Windward's systems are structured, so that'll be perhaps more relevant to people who have some more experience.
Okay, so Permaculture is primarily based on the concepts of ecology, and so ecology is the scientific framework of studying the relationships, the interconnections of life, and the relationships and processes that, that connect different components of an ecosystem. And ecology comes from, the root of ecology comes from the words, you break it down into eco and logy. Eco is from the root oiko, the same thing for economics, ecosystem, ecology. And oiko, as Andrew wrote there, means home or household. And logy is the study of. So really we're talking about the study of our household, of our home. And our home meaning this biosphere. And so when you think about economics, you go through that's studying the managers of our home and household. And so ecology is the study of our home and household. And so when you think about ecology, you're often talking about ecosystems, and there's different components of an ecosystem. Hi, there's some seats here up front. And so the elements of the ecosystem can be broken down into, if you guys could sit here, just because that was locked. When you think about elements of an ecosystem, it's often broken down into two components, the biotic and the abiotic. And so the biotic components of the ecosystem are the living components. So the things that people most often think about first would be plants and animals, and then fungi, bacteria, and so on. When you think about, if you go back to your high school biology class, the 5 different kingdoms of life, and that's the biotic component of the ecosystem. And then you have the abiotic, and the abiotic is often forgotten about, but it is similarly important. And the abiotic is the non-living components of an ecosystem, and things that include basically your climate, so your sun, there's rainfall, and temperature certainly, wind. Topography is also a component of the biotic or abiotic system. And so oftentimes in permaculture we are working with the abiotic and manipulating it and managing it so that we can control the biota and have the effect on the biota that we want to. And so
like the agro-culture bed is sort of like you're creating a context within which you can get certain plants to survive and be managed in certain ways, like without irrigation or without tilling, etc.
And so another way to think about this is what are the conditions for growth. And since so much of what we're trying to do is grow material, often what we're talking about is what are the conditions for growth. And one way to think about that is basically, very simply, that of energy, nutrients, and water. And that this is another way to think about the abiotic components of your system. And that you need to have some source of energy, which for the most part comes from the sun, and then water and nutrients. And so you're manipulating those components of your system to facilitate the growth of your plant matter, of your animals, certainly the bacteria and the fungi, which are less known or less visible pieces of the system. Just the sunshine there too. It's just a part of it.
Air.
Sure. Okay. So yeah, that's just sort of like the basic components of thinking about ecology.
And so as we talk more about ecology, we're just going to be showing you how these things interrelate more. So this is kind of the basics of ecology. This is how life operates in the context.
So at this point we're going to go through, I think, 5 or so key concepts of ecology, and some of them are gone into in more detail in your handout. We just want to go over some supplementary material here. Or help just explain the ideas a little bit more. So the first one is really that of a system. And so permaculture and ecology are both very much talking about systems. And a system could be defined as basically interconnected elements that are connected through processes and pathways. And so we're going to draw a little bit of a diagram to help illustrate that. So you have your elements of your system. So you can have a really simple system that's just two elements connected by a simple process. And so you can have a system that is as small as a molecule or a cell, a leaf. You could also scale it up to that of a living organism like a tree or an animal. Your system could be that of a watershed. Your system could be that of planet Earth. And so you really define your system. So a system has predetermined boundaries. And so that impacts how you think about managing it. And so as you add in more elements, then you have greater number of connections between the elements. And so when we just had two elements, there was basically just one way to connect between them. And obviously this is like a theoretical construction of these ideas. But as you add in more elements, you add in more interconnections. And that's much of what we do in permaculture is of having multiple niches and multiple individuals in each niche.
And it's important to understand that the more elements you have interconnected in the system, the amount of interconnectivity is like an exponential function. So say I have 5 dots and I add a 6th dot. When I added the 5th dot, I added 4 more connections. When I add here 1 more dot, I'm adding 5 more. If I add another one, I'll be adding 6 more. So it's getting more and more and more with every individual element. And so it quickly gets to be quite a jumble of lines in this diagram.
And so it's sort of our task as observers, as managers of a landscape, to try to decipher what are these different elements of the system and how are they connected, how are they facilitating each other, how are they impeding each other, how are they complementing, how are they competing.
What's their relationship to one another? Because everything is, as like the first law of ecology, that everything is connected to everything else. So even if you look, and it just looks like you have this thing that's over here and doesn't look like it's interacting much, it is really fundamentally connected to the whole context and every other piece of life. When you go up, scaling up the entire system, whether you're talking about just this little piece of land or a whole hillside or a whole watershed or the entire planet, that there is everything is fundamentally connected.
So Barry Commoner was a plant physiologist and one of the forefathers of ecology, which is a relatively new science in the grand scheme of it all, or at least a named science. And he proposed these 4 laws of ecology, which is explained more in detail in your handout. And the first law of ecology is what Andrew just mentioned, which is everything is connected to everything else, and that is illustrated more or less by this diagram. And so one of the what happens there is it's like you take out this element, all of a sudden you erase all those pathways. And so a corollary of the fact that everything is related to everything else is that you can't just change one element of the system.
You change all the relationships by taking out one.
Yeah, if you change one component of the system, you change the whole thing. You may not see it immediately, it may not make itself manifest immediately, but it is having an impact. And similarly, the second law of ecology is that there's no waste in nature. And so if you are, working with your garden or with your homestead, and you have this material, this element that you're creating, like, I don't know what to do with this, it's waste.
Like say you have sheep, and you have to shear them, otherwise they'll get overheated in the summertime. So you may have just like a big pile of wool, and what do you do with it? It can be seen as a waste product if you don't have a way to use it or functionally like put it back into the system.
And so then you basically have to be creative and come up with pathways to connect it back in. And an example from Windward for this is that we do raise animals, and that when we have dairy goats, for example, and so in order to maintain a certain population on the land, we have to harvest in the fall, and so that because in order to have milk, we have to have kids, and then in order to maintain a certain population of goats, then we have to cull out every season. And so in that process, then we generate offal, so the viscera content of the animal, which is not something that we necessarily want to eat. And so up until recently, we didn't really have a good way, an efficient or effective way of dealing with that offal. So we had this quote-unquote waste product. Yes, we could bury it in the forest and have the forest, take up its nutrients. And because we didn't really have, other than the chickens, we didn't have any omnivores. We mostly had grazers and creatures that eat grass and things along those lines. And so recently we got pigs. And so pigs now happily take care of that offal, and they convert it into lard, and they convert it into meat, and also the pigs are tillers. Their primary function is to till the earth, and so feeding the animal from what was once waste is now food. There's a notion, there's the book Cradle to Cradle that some of you may be familiar with, which basically proposes the idea that all waste is food. And so it's just really rethinking how we conceptualize waste. And so waste is really something that's just a part of the system that has yet to be incorporated, because there's always something that will eat it. So then moving on to processes. So processes are also could be considered pathways. And basically one way to conceptualize it is that each of these lines here is a pathway. It's a pathway to connect one element of a system to another, convert one element of the system into something else. And an example in terms of a process is basically that of creating soil. And if you think about leaf litter falling from a tree in the fall, and it accumulates in the soil, and part of it decomposes, the under components decompose, and then with time, and the next year, you have more leaf litter fall and more litter buildup, and then you have bacteria and fungi that begin to decompose the leaf litter. And so something that, so basically the idea that soil building is that of a process. And it's a process that happens dynamically through time. And so you may look at it, and it looks static at one moment in time, but it's constantly cycling back and forth.
So you can sort of imagine it's like, you start from a point, and you keep doing the same thing more or less every year. This is particularly true in like temperate climates, where you actually have like a broken up year. Whereas if you're more like in an equatorial region, the cycles are usually quicker because of the amount of sunlight and energy, but there's still like the same fundamental processes are going on through time.
I have a question.
Yes.
Yep.
I've read in articles on compost heaps, it's better not to put things like grease and meat in a small one.
Mm-hmm.
And I can sort of understand that. But on a large scale, you could, with a small amount of things, grease and meat, you could actually do that then, what you're doing with the pigs.
Yeah, I'm a little bit confused about your question, but it sounds as though you're talking about like if you have a large amount of vegetative matter, then putting a little bit of meat in it is not going to totally offset the system. Is that?
Yeah, I'm not going to try it because my compost heap's about as long as 2 bales end to end and twice as wide, so I don't want to do the meat thing.
One of the primary things with decomposing meat is that it usually takes a different type of bacteria operating at higher temperatures in order to break it down into soil. So incorporating it into a primarily vegetative compost pile may not actually be able to be broken down because it doesn't have the right kind of bacteria, or the compost pile just isn't hot enough, because the bacteria, I believe, are like require much higher temperatures.
About 160 something like that.
Yeah.
I,
And so-
I have recently watched what's his name? Lawton video on how to make a compost pile in 18 days without reduction of volume. My jaw hit the floor. But one of the things he was using, saying, well, minimum you need several cubic yards of this stuff, and give the exact proportion, exact mixtures. But one of the things he used was a little bit of rotten carcass.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And the temperature, as you say, was critical. You
Yeah.
had the thermometer stuck in it and it had to be cooking.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a
But
hot composting.
18 days and the pile didn't reduce, and I was like, wow. Mine always go, 5 cubic yards in, 1 out.
Let's see. So another key concept in ecology, which also is very relevant to permaculture, is that of a cycle. And so one way to think about cycles is basically elements being transformed in a system, but being retained. And so the example that we want to go into more in detail is out of the nitrogen cycle, because it is a pretty fundamental process that everybody trying to grow plants or raise animals needs to be aware of, and how nitrogen is transformed through the system. Nitrogen is an essential element for growth. It's basically the foundational element for proteins. And so everything that contains protein contains nitrogen. And it's often a limiting element for growth in gardens. And
So in terms of this, like, nitrogen is one of the biggest, plants like use nitrogen, and animals need nitrogen perhaps more than most any other nutrient besides just sheer energy, either in the form of carbohydrates or sunshine. So it's important to understand like how the nitrogen cycles and fertilities are happening on your land, and what you can do to create sort of self-renewing fertility of nitrogen in the system. Otherwise, you're limited by the amount of, if you have a limited amount of protein, you have a limited amount of leaf area that can actually be created, and thus you have a limited capacity to capture sunlight and a limited capacity to turn that sunlight and use that energy to do work or produce a yield. And so oftentimes it's nitrogen that is the most limiting factor.
So it's sort of ironic that nitrogen is a limiting factor because it is so abundant in the atmosphere. Nitrogen components about 70% of the atmosphere, but it's in the form of nitrogen gas, which is inert. And plants can't just take, nitrogen gas, they can't just take it from the atmosphere. It has to be converted. And so it is converted through a few different processes, but in terms of the biological process, it is converted through nitrogen-fixing bacteria, which is something you probably have heard about. And nitrogen-fixing bacteria convert inert nitrogen and nitrogen gas into ammonia in the form of NH3. But NH3 isn't very conducive to plants either. Plants don't really like NH3. They don't really like ammonia. They don't really have a good way of taking it up. And so then there's nitrifying bacteria, basically another form of bacteria that converts the ammonia into nitrite, which is NO2. And then another set of bacteria that convert it into nitrate, which is NO3. So yes, it's harkening back to some chemistry, some basic chemistry here.
What is this one?
NO2. So the nitrite just refers to the number of oxygen, and then 8. So ite is 2 oxygen, and then 8 is 3 oxygen.
So this is what the plants want.
Yeah, and so when you have nitrates in the soil, that is really the ideal form of nitrogen for your plants. And so it is essential then that you basically have living colonies of the bacteria that convert the nitrogen gas into ammonia, the ammonia into nitrite, and then nitrite into nitrate. And we have potentially one of the most obvious examples of this is in an aquaponic system. So we have aquaponic systems at least that function during the warmer months, and that when you don't have, so aquaponics, for people that aren't familiar, is the combination of growing fish with plants. So aquaculture, the growing of fish, with hydroponics, which is the growing of plants without soil. And so fish create a lot of ammonia, nitrogenous waste, and often if you're just growing fish, you have to clean out your fish tank or clean out the fish pond, and in order for the fish to survive and be healthy. And then if you're growing hydroponic plants, you often have to feed the plants with chemicals. That's at least how it's done industrially, because there's no nutrients in the water for them to take up. And so if you combine those systems, you have something that's producing a lot of nitrogenous waste, the fish, and you have something that takes up nitrogenous waste, the plants, then it's sort of an elegant solution, which nature has already come up with, obviously, in the forms of natural lakes and ponds where the fish, nobody has to come in and clean out the lake, the natural lake, for the fish to be able to thrive. The plants are doing it for it, yeah.
Just curious about commercial fertilizers. You're using fertilizers and how that works. Commercial fertilizers are the NO3, right? I mean, so are they shortcutting the process that the soil that this goes through, or what?
Well, there's a lot of ways that commercial fertilizers are made, but one of the primary ways is through an industrial process where they take coal and basically energy from natural gas or coal or something like that, and do a physical chemistry process to go from N2 to nitrate or N2 to ammonia.
They make syngas first, and that's really rich in nitrogen, and then they can go through that process.
And it's often why we talk about when we say if we're eating industrially grown food, monoculture crops, that we're eating oil.
Because the whole nitrogen fertility of the cycle is dependent upon fossil fuels in this industrial, I would say, abiotic process where it's not living things that are making it. They're just doing a physical chemistry
So that has
reaction.
a detrimental effect on the living system, right? Using fertilizers.
In
I'm
these
not
large amounts, yeah. And I mean, that's often when you have nitrates and that then they're applied so heavily that the plants then don't take them all up and they're washed into the waterways, and you know, you go down into the Gulf of Mexico and there's dead zones, and that's basically because you have so much excess nitrogen, which was once a limiting factor for growth in those ecosystems. There's now a flush of it, and now so the algae is like, ooh, yeah, I'm gonna grow. And then as it decomposes, it uses up all the oxygen in the decomposition process, and you basically create a dead zone, which then there's no.
So the fertilizers don't kill the biotics in the soil, or
Not directly.
or hurt the
No.
system as such?
Not at least not that I'm aware
I mean, you
of.
certainly could
It
make
sets it
your
off
soil
balance.
like, what is it, like basic or something? If you added a lot of a certain compound that was basic, I'm pretty sure that's basic. Meaning alkaline, so that could upset the life in the soil.
Certainly
But
something I could-
also in processes where there's constant tilling going on and large applications of nitrogen fertilizer, another aspect of that system is that they're constantly breaking up the soil structure, and they're constantly having just like a single sort of layer of plants that all are in competition with one another and all only have a certain small amount of root system, and so that increases the amount of just like loss of nutrients because you have less roots, less plants to take stuff up, less diversity. When water falls, it's like, you know, hitting bare soil, it's causing more erosion, etc. So the whole system that is dependent upon nitrogen fertilizer being brought in, there's so many other aspects of it that make it just hostile or destructive to like soil life.
Yeah.
Oftentimes it is a very dead kind of soil just because it's constantly being disturbed and exposed to freezing and thawing and wind erosion and drying out. Whereas in a forest setting you'll have the mulch layer that's helping to protect the soil and creating the context for lots of life.
So where I was going with the aquaponics example is basically that you are going through a similar cycle, and it's very visible when you can test water for these components better than you can test soil, or more easily than you can test soil. And so you can say, oh, I have lots of NO2, but I don't have any NO3, which basically means I don't have this bacteria that converts from here to here. And so what I would suspect in a system where they're dumping a lot of this into it, that there's less need for these other bacteria. And so then to transition to a management practice where you're trying to have a fertility cycle that is not reliant on those industrial fertilizers, then you would have to basically be inoculating the soil with beneficial bacteria, or these nitrogen-fixing bacteria and nitrifying bacteria that help to complete that cycle.
Or you'd have to wait a really long time for the bacteria to come and populate and for the whole cycle to get underway.
So oftentimes we talk about nitrogen-fixing plants, and that's a key, talk about alfalfa or clover, beans, peas. These are certain, there's fewer temperate woody species, but there are a few. Locusts, for example. that are nitrogen fixing plants. And basically what that means is that they have an association with the bacteria, these nitrogen fixing bacteria that converts the atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia.